Okay, and I want to welcome everybody to our monthly Leadership Forum Community Incubating Leadership Conversation. So just to mention, the Leadership Forum community is a nonprofit 501c3. It has a long history, over 100 years, of providing a space for leaders to convene and explore leadership challenges, to develop conscious leaders, and also to create solutions that result in meaningful and equitable change in organizations, education, and society. So part of what we offer are these monthly incubating leadership conversation sessions. They're learning and development conversations that serve as a safe space for leaders to convene and discuss a topic. Today, we're going to be talking about gender bias. And our provocateurs, those that come to lead these sessions, share their insights, their tools, their perspectives about a topic that they're passionate about, and engage people in a way that facilitates conversation and learning. So please let me know if you want to be included in further emails. If you aren't on our distribution list and found out about this in some other way, please in the chat indicate that you want to be put on the mailing list, and we're happy to send you an email about future events that we're planning. If you're not speaking, please mute your mic so that we don't have too much background noise. And so today we are going to be talking about gender bias, and this is our second session about gender bias. We did one back in October that talked more about where bias comes from. Today we're going to talk about more about how we can retrain ourselves in terms of bias. And we have Crystal Clay, who's going to moderate our session today. And we have three wonderful panelists also. We have Johannes Jadagne and also Lynette Gomez and Rachel Adams that are going to be the panelists today. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Crystal to get us started.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you so much for joining the conversation today. We are so much looking forward to engaging you in the conversation, and we want to welcome you. We're excited about our discussion today. And as Anne said, this is part two of a two-part series that's being presented by the Women in Leadership Lab. And that started in 2021 at the LFC Summit. And we are absolutely still looking and welcoming our new persons who are interested in being a part of that. And for those of you who weren't a part of the first session, we learned about how bias works, and we heard from three dynamic panelists then, and they shared their perspectives and they shared their experiences. And we were really excited about continuing the conversation today. And Anne led that conversation as the moderator. And in that conversation, we discovered that we were reading the same book but in our community. And this is how it all got started. We were in the Women in Leadership. We were talking about the different books that we were reading. And we both discovered that we were both reading The End of Bias by Jessica Nordell. And so we started to share our takeaways about gender bias and bias in general. And we were so intrigued by the different facets of the discussion that we wanted to expand the conversation to a broader audience, hence the beginning of the two-part series. And so last month, we uncovered all that we have in terms of biases, and we unpacked how those biases formed and how they can become a limiting force in our culture. And for those of you who were not there, we know that a bias now is a personal preference. It's a like or dislike. It's something that certainly colors our view of the world. And we know that the root of all of our stereotypes and prejudices, they impact society. So when we think about that in terms of, in addition to our own experiences, our culture around us really contributes to our stereotypes. And when we think about how our culture dictates the judgments and we make concerning our stereotypes, that is when we can run into trouble. So I'm so glad that we have persons from different cultures that are here representing where they are now, but also their respective cultures as well. So in that, we know that biases, they're not inherently bad, but they have had just a very destructive impact when used incorrectly. But today we are looking at part 2, where we're going to dive into some deep work and changing our biased brains. And we'll focus on how we can move beyond our inherent gender biases to create change in our workplaces and our culture. And I am beyond thrilled to have with us a global panel in the form of 3 dynamic panelists: Lynette Gomez, Rachel Zardi Adams, and Johannes Yadane, and they're going to introduce themselves in just a second. And then we'll give you an opportunity to participate in the discussion in the breakout rooms as well. And I just want to give a shout out to Latanya as part of the summit, and really enjoyed your session and look forward to continuing the conversation as well. And so to set the context, let's break down bias and understanding that bias is built on habits. And therefore, just like any change, as Kurt Lewin says, we need to unfreeze, change, and refreeze some of the habits that we have. So therefore, it's not enough to make people aware of their biases. People need to be motivated to change. We also know that pointing out bias is common, and therefore it may translate into something that is normal, and people may feel that it is okay. And it's not okay to normalize biases. And then there's also a tendency to insist that you are not biased, but most people will rank their objectivity much higher than their behavior dictates. But our brain activity indicates that when people are trying to not be biased, they actually attend more to differences. And the final thing that I want to point out before we go into our conversations is that those affected most by discrimination and bias are willing to work the hardest to break it down and to create change. And that's why I'm so excited about the amazing guests that I have today who are willing to do just that. And so welcome, Rachel, Lynette, and Johannes. I'm going to give you an opportunity to briefly introduce yourselves, starting with Rachel, Lynette, and then our one male who is representing today, that is Johannes. And then we'll dive into some of the intriguing questions that we have for you. So Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Anne. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on what time it is, wherever you are. It's good to be with it's good to be with everyone here. It's evening, it's 9 p.m. my time. Good to be back. I haven't been in the community for quite a while, but looking forward to this conversation. I'm a leadership and transformation specialist, and part of my work is in the DEIB space. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Great to have you.
Thank you, everyone. I see some familiar faces, some new faces. I've been involved with the Leadership Forum community for almost a few years now, a little over 2 years. I'll actually be becoming the board chair come January for the LFC. And, this organization means a lot for moments like this, where we can hold space and talk about things that might be a little uncomfortable. My background is I worked in multinational technology companies for 20 years in B2B marketing. And I left that world and helped technology companies now from the outside through executive and team coaching, executive recruitment, as well as digital marketing consulting. So it was just interesting, even preparing for today, thinking about it through the different lens of childhood and career, and as mom now, and how this gender bias shows up for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynette. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody. My name is Johannes. Yeah, I live in Ethiopia. I was born in Ethiopia, and later on I moved to Canada. Then I just come back, and I do leadership development and coaching and consulting. And more than anything else, I work with the tribe group, sometimes child soldiers, and the people being upper group. So even though I'm not qualified to be here like you guys, but because the need is so great, wherever I go, and it make me looks like a champion. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm the father of 3 beautiful girls, and my wife is so happy. I'm just speaking behalf of a gender bias, so so I'm here.
Well, thank you, Johannes, and I beg to defer that you are absolutely qualified, more than qualified to be here. And yes, Rachel, please shake your head rigorously in agreement. And we are honored to have you as part of the panel. And we appreciate the work that you were doing out there in the field. And I would dare say an unsung hero, doing work behind the scenes that no one knows about, but that is important to your community and to your culture. And I want to take a moment to pause and thank you for that. So I have a first question for you. And, as you reflect on some of the common stereotypical behaviors, and there are so many from so many different facets, but what prevents the breakdown of stereotypes is the first part of the question. And the second part is, why have they persisted even when they don't make sense and get in the way of greater success? And I'll pose that question to Lynette first, if you don't mind, and then Johannes, and then Rachel.
Great. Thank you. I thought about this a lot. And, when I think about, common stereotypical behaviors, if you think about it, and I don't know if any of you, I even invite all of you to take just a pause to think for yourselves what stereotypes you might have unconsciously or subconsciously, right? I mean, I know I do. And to me, what comes up is, for stereotypes are familiar, they're comfortable, they're easy, they're like, no, I mean, it's easier to stay in stereotype than it is to move away from. And so, we're not wired for that discomfort unless we're really comfortable in this discomfort. And so I think that's a big barrier for that breakdown. And then if you think about it, if you take a little further, why does it maybe get in the way? Well, in that comfort and in that ease of using stereotypes, if you were to think about dismantling them, that is deep work, just like the title of today's event, right? And deep work is definitely not easy. And what I find ironic about all of this is stereotypes aren't based on science. I mean, they're literally not true, right? So if you think about, I'll give you one example. Women are great multitasker. Well, if anyone here has studied the brain and neuroscience, none of us are built to be multitasker. Why was that informed for hundreds of years? Because at some point there needed to be some sort of explanation for why women had to do more, right? And we now see women as being better, not all of us, but that is an example, right? And so what would it take to come out of that stereotype would mean a deep change, not just ones that we can control, but society at large. So that's some sort of initial thinking I have around that. Crystal, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you raised the issue of being comfortable, because no one likes to be uncomfortable. And that is certainly a choice that we make, to decide to be uncomfortable with that. And so I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because being uncomfortable means that also you're being vulnerable and that you're losing something when you make the choice to change. And that is such a great question that you asked us to go internally and think about our own selves and think about what we're willing to change. So thank you, Lynette. Rachel.
Thank you so much. I'll just piggyback on what Lynette just said. I think stereotypes hold because they are such an intrinsic part of our cultural milieu, of our social milieu, of our storytelling, of the things that we deem to make us who we are. And so to interrupt them is to displace things. And I think people struggle with that displacement. And of course, it's important to recognize that stereotypes can be both positive and negative, but whichever way you're looking at them, there's a certain kind of safety around keeping the stories that we've always told. I'm remembering some time ago, a woman that I love was in a public forum told by her husband that she had laughed too loud, and was really chastised for it. And I found it fascinating because that observation was made because it threatened what was held in place, which is sort of the sense that, you know, women should be demure and they should behave in a particular way. And so I think that that happens, and we do the same thing in other directions as well. It's not just women who are suffering, of course, from gender bias. It's all sorts of people. So I think it's that holding in place that we are also desperately trying to keep, that can be the hindrance to the shift.
Wow, you know, I'm hearing some powerful words here in terms of interruption, displacement, discomfort, and those are powerful words, and they certainly describe some of the reasons why we find it so difficult to move out of one place into a place of real freedom in terms of our biases. And so I thank you for sharing that and sharing the stories that we tell ourselves. And it's a call to action for us to think about what we are thinking about and where did we get the story. So thank you for that. And Johannes, I invite you to add to that.
Yeah, thank you. I just even catching myself how I view in a society, especially even my own family. I think it's as much as you hear my accent, right? Like we are the result of our environment and the thinking pattern, how people around us, you know, think that become norm, and that's how we view, see the world. That's the lens we wear. That's the glass we wear. And I'm one of the 12 in my family, and for one mother, one father. And growing up in our family, there's so many kids. I'm almost the youngest one. And my mother, not only us, she always taking anybody poor to feed, and they become child. And she just keep doing that. And because of that, she cannot even finish grade 12. And I remember my dad worked for agriculture minister. And people ask me who am I? Who's my dad? What my dad do? I tell them proudly, my dad worked for agriculture minister, something like that. Then how about your mom? Then I'll be really squint. It's my mother doesn't have a job, right? That's how the society look at it. That's how my family look at it. That's how everybody look at it. That's how I look at it. And for a long time, I used to say my mother doesn't have a job. And until I have my own children and just raising, children as if it's not a job. So growing up, that's now when I look back, that's a bias, that's a stereotype, what everybody thinks that way in the society. For me, I didn't even flinch, and that's how I look at it. And I think when Dyer say, when you change how we look at things, the change with the things we look at changes. So the perspective, it's have to be in our mind. It's not, we don't see it with our eyes, of course, we just see it with our mind. So that's something for me, okay, here's the value, what society holds, how everybody see it and name it. And we have to, go back to because majority doing it, or because that's how it's being done. And we need to stop and look at it, what need to be valued or out the pattern. I don't know if I answered to you. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Johannes, I thought you were the unsung hero, but your mother, now she trumps all of that with raising 12 children. I'm so glad that you qualify your statement to say that it was one mother and one father. And so we certainly applaud her, first of all. And I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing how you would respond to the questions, and you may represent many others who respond to the questions in the same way. And sometimes even, as you said that, I was even thinking about attribution error. And even sometimes we can take on those roles that other people place on us, or we can take on the perceptions that other people place on us. And oftentimes that happens with roles and identity. And I so appreciate the fact that you spoke to that issue of identity and what that means. And oftentimes we also associate whatever job or whatever role we have with our identity. And our identity is so much more, so much richer than that. Just changing the perspective over time, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to hear and understand how that happened in terms of how you change your perspective. Oh, yes, you did say that. You said when you had your own children and you realize. And so it is when we get to the place, sometimes when we have to step into the shoes of someone else, that you're able to see things from a different perspectives. And I'm going to go back and repeat your quote. You said, when we change the way we look at things, the things that we look at change. And that really brings us very much to our next question, which is, what are some of the key considerations, whether it's from an individual, organization, or cultural perspective, that we should take into account when implementing change to make more inclusive workplaces? And I'll start with Rachel this time. That's okay with you, Rachel? And
Yeah,
then
sure
Lynette,
thing.
and then I'll come back to Johannes.
Sure. My sense is that it has to be both. I think the most important thing is that all culture change programs, all diversity programs, all inclusivity programs have to consider what's at the micro level and what's at the macro level. So there has to be a conversation about personal transformation, which is often the harder conversation. And then there has to be a conversation about the broader transformations within the space. I'm reminded, for example, at a micro level, that some years ago, I coached a woman who came to me. She works in a large organization. And she said to me, Rachel, I'll never make it in this organization. I'm a senior manager. I want to become a C-suite executive. And I'll never make it because, as she described it, it's a white male organization. And so I said to her, that's interesting. Let's unpack that. I'm interested to hear what you mean by that term. And it was fascinating because as we had the conversation, it became clear to her that what she had carried in her mind was a cultural affiliation story that her and her peers had been talking about. Because upon asking her, if you perceive that there is some people who are standing in the way of your success in the organization, who are they? And she actually couldn't name a single person. It was such a fascinating aha for her, because she said, well, it's like the story that I just carry in my head. And I said to her, well, how about we name in the opposite direction? Are they people who've reached out to you, who've offered support? And she found that she had quite a considerable list. I mean, the long and short of that story is that a year later, she was in the C-suite, and she had 2 C-suite positions, actually. And it was so fascinating to her how so many of her white male colleagues had come to support her and carry her along. But she had never thought this was possible, because there's a story she was affiliated to, and it almost felt like it would be a betrayal to speak differently about her experience. So even though she was having different experiences, she kind of felt afraid to say that actually I'm having support, and actually I'm having a different experience. And I think this is one of the dangers of this historical moment, right? Is that we can all get caught up in the single story and lose the nuance of our micro and our personal experiences that can be quite powerful in giving diversity even to the conversation. And then, of course, at a macro level, it's about how are we at every step of the way, through choice architecture, through strategy, making sure that our systems can indeed shift. So one of the things I often say is, we have to create forced exposures within the organization for people to support each other where it was either often difficult, or maybe there was a sense that you're not my typical role model. I think we have to be willing to change those narratives at a macro level and put in place strategies and systems within the systems that counteract the old story. So I'm reminded of a time again where we were designing a program for transformation. And one of the messages we drove was, if you're finding a mentor or a sponsor, make sure they're different from you. Because of course, the human brain will go towards what's comfortable because it's always solving for reducing anxiety. How do you make sure that you create forced exposures for yourself so that the pattern recognition for people who are different in your brain enlarges, right? And you don't feel so intimidated. And this can be hard, but indeed, this is what shifts the system is if we're creating those new systems within systems of transformation.
Oh, that is so rich. I love the shifting from the single story, that narrative. And I'm seeing some of the comments in the chat about busting free of the narrative concept that I'm seeing here. And Charlie says, I've been busting free for almost 76 years. And so I appreciate that. And still that you're busting free. So there's no time limit to that, Charles. And so I appreciate you saying that. And, that changing that narrative from a single story, especially when it's a single story that not only that you've told yourself, but it's a single story that you've told to others. And oftentimes when we tell someone else something, then it makes us more accountable. And there is a level of expectation when we tell ourselves a narrative and tell others a narrative, that it's almost like that self-fulfilling prophecy. And so we have to break free of that. And I'm loving this term that's coming through the chat of busting free of our single narrative. And then, so shifting from that single story is so important. And it's a question to all of us to think about, what is our single story that we're telling ourselves that is placing a limitation on ourselves? And I so appreciate this, the term that you've used in terms of forced exposures. And I've personally not heard that term, but it is certainly something that is an opportunity to expand the mind, expand the experience, and expand, I would dare say, the opportunity to grow and develop. And absolutely, organizations should provide that, because there are some organic and some natural experiences and exposures that people have. And if you're different, then you might not have a natural access to those opportunities. And so thank you so much for sharing that. Lynette, I'd love to hear your perspective. Yes, Sue, I see self-limiting beliefs could benefit from such forced exposures. Thank you, Sue.
Yeah, I love what Rachel was sharing. And, using that word systems, I'm thinking about systems in an organization, right? You have the individual, you have sort of the team, and then the organization as a whole. There's all kinds of things to consider. I think one of the things we tend as individuals, whether we're leading or we're an individual contributor, it doesn't really matter. We kind of gloss over our own self-awareness of where we stand in our own biases, right? So like we're really quick to go, don't say, hey guys, in a meeting, or I'm going to model this kind of behavior, or I'm going to, have this different type of hiring practice, or hold myself to different standards. And yet we may have no clue as to where we are in our own bias, and gender being one of them. Last week, I was facilitating a cross-functional team half-day workshop, right? And it was unusual in that it's a technology company, and 4 of the 5 people were women. The longest person that everyone there was either stretching into a leadership role or were relatively new to the organization. The male happened to be there the longest, had the longest tenure by 8 years more than everyone else, and just knew more about the organization. And so it was interesting to even see how do you hold space and honor each person's style and not stereotype why, what behaviors look like and what words are in those sessions. And it was interesting because he had the tendency to talk more, make decisions more, because he was more comfortable. And what he didn't realize is he was kind of taking over the space and in meetings from a place of truly trying to help, not disparaging the others. And what was funny was we created the space, which was a mix of training and exercises. And halfway through, they said, you know what? The women said, we're enjoying this dialogue so much, we don't want any more training. We want you to hold space so we can. And so just kind of being aware of also just, depending on the kind of work you do, just being aware of the space you're holding and dynamics within the group, and watching your own sort of biases you might have in that. So the other sort of, and so if I were to go a step deeper from like self-awareness and just being aware of the space you're in, the space you may be holding, also thinking about why, like what really matters about the change you want to make, and not only what is your role, what do you want, what does the organization want, what does the team want, what does the leader want, what does the individual want, and how like that's going to be hard work. Like as much as DE&I trainings are great, they're not necessarily going to get into the sort of exercising and sort of active behaviors and language and all of that needs to really shift, and really identifying what makes sense for that system. And so, like, I'll give you another example. Another consideration is hiring, right? I hear from hiring managers all the time, I want to hire more diverse. What do you mean by that? Why does it matter, right? Sometimes it's simply because their funding is based on having a diverse bench. That's all it is. And then I challenge them to say, well, I'm going to present you candidates that might have 6 of the 10 skills. And it's because they didn't have as much privilege. They might even not have a college education. Are you going to be okay with that? But they do have passion and they do have potential, right? Men tend to get based more on their potential, women on their performance. And yet, when you're looking at candidates, you tend to look at what their actual sort of accolades are, where maybe a woman might have not had those opportunities as much as another man. And so just kind of being comfortable in knowing where you are in your own bias, and then being comfortable in sort of challenging the way you show up and how others are kind of showing up with you, and getting comfortable in those dialogues. So yeah, that's some thinking around some considerations at a systemic level.
Oh, I'm so glad that you addressed the issue of leadership and your role as a leader, and whether you are the leader of the group or you are acting in the leadership role as you were facilitating yesterday. And the fact that sometimes if you are facilitating, you might have your own agenda, your own flow. And I'm so glad that you captured that moment to hold the space. And that is a model for organizations as well, and for leaders to think about when there are natural conversations that are happening, where people feel safe and they feel vulnerable, and they are talking about the things that are important to them, to not cut off those conversations, but to encourage that dialogue and keep that dialogue going and foster a culture of open dialogue so that you begin to build trust. Because if you don't know one another, it's hard to trust one another. And so I'm so glad that that you mentioned that. And having facilitated a global session just yesterday, of course, I had my agenda, and then the agenda went over by 4 hours because I held that space that was desperately needed. And so I didn't know that what I was doing until you just mentioned it, Lynette. But for organizations, for leaders to find places to hold that space and to ask questions in terms of understanding where people are and what's your why for doing this is such an important question. It will reveal so very much. So thank you for just such a broad brush view of different perspectives. And I'm seeing quite a number of the chat. Thank you, Lynette. Our dialogue and our sharing of stories is what connects us. Yes, absolutely, Sue. And I see that Sue says the what really matters about the change you want to make seems like an important thing to think about. And what really matters might take us to looking more closely at our values, others' values, and the most good for the greatest number. Thank you. Thank you so much. We are really just enjoying your perspectives. And the last question that I have for you before we go out into our breakout groups and we speak a little bit more and dive a little bit deeper, which we're really looking forward to, is in your view, what is required to support the business case for change? And what are some of the triggers or symptoms that bias may actually be below the surface? And that's always an interesting one, because by nature of the fact that it's below the surface, that means that it's much harder to identify. So I'll start with you, Johannes, this time.
Thank you. I think just creating awareness. Maya Angelou say, when you know better, you do better. Just creating awareness. I think sometimes we think if people think like a man, woman things, it's just about society things. As we want to develop a society, I just want to give you examples. Sometimes I work with a tribe group, very border and limited access for everything else. And in a city, in a bigger city, it seems like people maybe the more awareness, people, even women, can find a job, or sometimes the life force them to work and be some kind of fairness relatively compared to seeing rural area, especially for far away. So I work with the Sudan border, the tribe called Gums. They are really discriminated, and the way they live, like they follow cows sometimes. Anyhow, there's no electricity, there's no school or hospital or clinic, any kind of things. On top of that, and I think other people benefiting from them not having education, and because they have precious stone like a gold, the marble, and the other stuff, and they not even sometimes qualified to work there. And sometimes there's a cotton farm, then they get monthly wage, very friction. So because of their illiterate or there's no education, they just hold them that way. And there's also culture being biased, especially against women so much. So they do have some kind of tradition which is oppress a woman so much. For example, if man want to marry a woman from that tribe, they gave a cows for their father, then they could take her. Once they could take her, she's almost kind of property. So sometimes they want to save that cows, and they do sister trading. Means like if I marry my wife, I didn't marry her from that tribe. I didn't do that. If I marry my wife, then my wife brother want to marry my sister, just an example. So then my sister, she might not be ready to get married. She might be 12, she might be 7 years old. And because of trade-offs, she still go there to work and pretty much to fetch water, to collect firewood, and to raise somebody's kid until she's ready to raise her own kind of things. So because of she's like they are almost kind of property, they don't give them, even send them to schools. Schools sometimes like only grade 4 around there. There's no even other education or school system. So in order to tackle that issue, to create awareness, of course, I'm not going to go to you're not treating women well, kind of, who am I to tell them that? But I'm a qualified soccer coach. So I go to train guys as a soccer coach. As we developing a relationship, I really believe like you cannot speak in anybody else without trust. You cannot have trust without a relationship. Relationship means like we have to do something together, or we have to have a common language, understanding. So soccer is a easy sport. Everybody love it. Everybody could contribute or involve in it. I go, do a training. Then after that, we sit under a tree, hanging flip chart in a tree, and we go through some kind of identity. Then we go back to, again, training in the field or in a pitch. Then there's a moment one time I was asking him to dribble something, a skill and right foot, then ask them, now stop, you have to do left. They say, no, we cannot, the left is bad. What do you mean? Like, our left foot is bad, like, left cannot do anything. I was like, why so? If it's bad, can I chop it off? Because this is your women. You don't give it a chance and you don't involve it. You train one foot or one foot better than another. Then you say, this is good, this is bad. But you have a chance to train both of them and to give equal opportunity. Yet you cannot live without it. Even if you require, you could say it like it's bad, but still you depend on that. You depend one foot to walk another kind of thing. So that was a teaching moment. I'm talking about like maybe it's not in a corporate word, but from grassroots. Sometimes, like, as I'm going to quote back again for Maya Angelou, say, like, when you know better, you do better, right? Like, that's have to be practical enough. Because of that, then they're able to bring their wife, their sisters, and they, for the first time, they say, we run for fun. We used to run for not to be late, just taking grain to meal places or fetching water, like not be late for our children. But even though they came with their baby, they are hanging in a bag, not properly dressed, but still able to play soccer, able to attend the training. So I think, they are doing it for them, right? Like if you want to advance in society, you have to involve in half of your body. Like you cannot live without it. It's better to involve it, to know what you know, so you could advance together. I was telling them, like, no, if I get this far because of my mother, and I cannot just like hold the credit away, because like I spend more time, especially until I'm in the age of 6 or 7. I was like all the time with my mother than even with my father. My father tried to be a breadwinner, like, so I was saying, like, no, I'm the product of my mother if I got this far. So you better spend and invest on you, in women, half of your society if we want to advance and forward. So I think creating awareness, that's what I believe. And that's what I saw change. And in fact, I just want to tell you a little testimony. So I shared with the woman, and, when you're going to go to school, say like, nobody believe in us, nobody send us. Then so we are too late to go to school, but I just told them, you're never too late to learn. You're never too young to teach. If you've never done it, so your children, they don't have a role model, your girls, when is going to be break that cycle? So after the trainings happened, 62 women for first time went to school. And that was very shocking. I know good news doesn't make news, but that's unheard. Even the district people are asking what happened. Then they told them because of the training. What kind of training? Then we just, we saw like, we have to add value to ourselves in order to be valuable. And then that district people, women being selected to go train other villages. So that's even after I left that place, it's like, you know, this thing is still happening. So yeah, creating awareness, I believe, using this is like, you know, truth, right? Like, you know, knowing this is truth. You know, here you have 2 feet, but you favor one, you don't favor another one. Then you say, this is bad, this is good. So when we give them opportunity, all could be better and all could grow, and for the better of the society. Yeah, back to you.
Wow. My goodness, I'm really just kind of taken aback by your story and how you are, you know, first of all, the fact that 62 women are now empowered and are now being educated and now having that that opportunity that they would not have otherwise. And the fact that these eyes have been opened in a new way is so inspirational for all of us. And I so appreciate how you are using soccer and you know, being so innovative in teaching leadership differently, and using the soccer ball to seize teaching moments and to bring transformation and shape the mindsets or reshape the mindsets in a culture that is deeply ingrained in one set of thinking, and you're helping to make that shift. And you know, it really goes to show, as you said, you know, news that doesn't make the news, good news that doesn't make the news, but it goes back to your why, and why are you doing this? And while it might not have seemed like you might have made an impact in the beginning, when you started off playing, look at the impact now. And when we do things with the right intention, then we eventually will see the fruit. Sometimes we may not see the fruit, but we keep doing what we are doing because we're committed to our why. And so thank you for being committed to your why and being committed to making change in your community, and giving us a different worldview that many of us on this line have not fully appreciated. And that's why I appreciate this conversation so much, because you add another perspective that we don't often hear. So thank you for being up at 11 o'clock at night, you and Rachel, to have this conversation. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Crystal. For me, I think it's 3 things, and I'll say them very briefly. I think the first one is we have to love the data. We have to fall in love with the research. If we're going to have strong business cases and support those business cases for change, we have to work with real meta-analysis that help us understand what is really going on. I remember some time ago coming across research that had been done by 2 professors at Georgetown University and Harvard University that show that, you know, often we say, for example, women leaders don't take as many risks as male leaders do, and then found out that it was actually because when women leaders take risks and they fail, then they get punished much more than their peers do. And so we don't want to be spending time and energy sending women on negotiation or risk-taking trainings. And what we should be doing is having a real courageous conversation about punitive measures in our own organizations and what kinds of choices we make around that. So I think that's really important. Let's work with the data. Let's avoid sweeping statements, broad generalizations, because it's always nuanced, and that's where the richness is. I think the second thing is there has to be buy-in, especially from a leadership perspective. I'm currently working with an organization now that has created a millennial board within their organization out of some of their promising future leaders to start to tackle the conversation of diversity, equity, inclusion. And so they're putting resources into this. They're really saying we want to make sure that we have people who are taking time to really understand the problem. And because it's a company that's in 7 or 8 African countries, there's so much nuance within that. In some places it's gender, in some places it's ethnicity, in some places it's race. And so you again have to really have buy-in so that we're really understanding the problem and attacking it from where it should be attacked. And then finally, I think we shouldn't be afraid to measure people on their individual contributions. I think one of the things I find that's often missing is a hesitation to put these things into our review systems, right? Which is, you know, how do we make sure that you're going to take this seriously? Let's measure how much effort you're putting into this. And I don't think this should scare people because, you know, in many other aspects of our performance in the organization, we know it's going to show up in the review. And I think if we think this is a serious conversation, then we mustn't be afraid to measure folk on how they're doing and how committed they are.
Those are some such great points, such practical, because people certainly pay attention to what is measured. And that's where you put your money where the mouth is, where the real accountability certainly comes in. And that creativity of using a millennial board is so fascinating and so innovative. And you talk about divergent thinking and a ground up approach. I certainly, you know, that is certainly something that could be best practice for many organizations. And so thank you for sharing those 3 really profound and practical strategies that organizations can do to really begin to shape change and do the deep work. Thank you, Rachel. Lynette?
Great. Are we, Crystal, are we talking now about sort of what's required in the business case for change?
Yes,
Wonderful.
we are.
Great. I mean, I thought about this, and it's kind of like a macro thinking and a micro thinking is where my brain went, sort of. I mean, there's countless reasons of why there would be a great business case for this. And I mean, much like Rachel's talking about data, there's data to support the business case in general, right? We know that if we had a more balanced workforce, you know, you would actually have better, you get better results, you get better productivity, you get a better bottom line, better revenue, you know, all of that. And yet, it's still not, the shift is not happening as quickly as we would want it to be, right? You think about just, you know, like much like this millennial team that Rachel was talking about, you know, finding ways to sort of make that shift in the organization is obviously going to increase the motivation of the staff, right? It's obviously going, you know, if done right, you can better manage talent. And even when it comes to performance management, that's even broken for women, right? Because it's that meritocracy thinking, right? It is amplifying how we are measured as women compared to men when there's an advantage that they have in getting to the finish line, right? And so what happens in those performance reviews? We get told we're not confident enough, right? I wish that word didn't exist. As much as confidence is important, it's overused, especially towards women. And so even thinking about, you know, from a business case standpoint, things like I mentioned productivity, performance, but also sort of the reputation of the organization at large, right? Not just sort of shareholders and not just, you know, shareholders obviously include employees, but also shareholders that are like how you attract the best kind of talent, right? And so I don't want to tell somebody that we didn't pick them because they're not a culture fit. I think that's complete nonsense. You know, some people use this term, finding a culture add versus a culture fit. That makes things a little more interesting, and that's where you really shake things up. And so, you know, yeah, I think, you know, in all those dimensions, and then, you know, as a leader, how can you be really thoughtful in your own business case for your own team of why this is important, right? And much like Rachel was talking about, how can you even maybe have a mechanism in ways that are meaningful in performance management or just tracking on sort of what people are measured on and how you're going to hold them accountable to some of that behavior change, and sort of opening up how they might look at situations or react to situations. Couple other interesting data points of when organizations, especially like the management team, is a more balanced mix of men and women, is that women, when that happens, when they're in leadership roles, they tend to make more managed risk. They tend to, this is tendencies, right? I want to be really careful, it's not a stereotype. They may spend more time in innovating within their own R&D, research and development teams, versus looking at merger and acquisition strategies, right? That's not good or bad. It's a different type of tendency. And I started to wonder, why is that? Is it because we as women have always had to sort of be resourceful with what we have? So you kind of look at your sort of what you're looking after, and how do you navigate that in sort of managing risk with reward? And there is value to that, right? If everyone just kind of applied the same strategies, you kind of have the same results. So it's just interesting to see how sort of you have sort of the benefits of having a more balanced, team of leaders across men and women, and sort of how they should tend to show up a little differently. And there's value in that, and then sort of mixed approaches and mixed way of looking at things, and just different. Yeah. And I'm being really careful to not have a bias in even what I'm saying. I'm being really cautious in my words. Yeah. And so those are some thoughts that I'm having. The other, the question was around triggers or symptoms, right?
Yes.
That bias may be below the surface. I would say, for the business, I mean, it's kind of like, if there's a business case for the things I mentioned, then the triggers could be why this whole thing about great resignation, right? Why are they leaving without a reason, without an exit interview? Why are they going to one interview and not coming back for a second? Why don't they want to apply to your company in the first place? What's happening, like that team I mentioned last week? I interviewed each person one-on-one, and the common denominator across the women that were in that room was that they are actually afraid to make a mistake. They're afraid to make a mistake. And so that fear, and I'm not going to say that they weren't confident, I'm going to be careful about that. They were afraid to make a mistake. So what they need to know is that they're allowed within reason to take some risk, even if they're going to trip a little bit along the way, because otherwise they're not going to grow and the group's not going to grow. And then you end up having a single point of failure in a team if everyone's holding back, right? So when you start to see some of that unraveling, we as leaders need to pay attention at what the root cause is. So that's all from me on that one.
Oh my goodness, there's so much in there, and you were talking about the beginning. You talked about this amplifying women and the expectations, and using words that are oftentimes associated with what is expected of the other gender, and you like confidence, and oftentimes we hear executive presence, and we know that some of those words are trigger words for women. And so I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because sometimes those can be what we subtly can be seen as microaggressions, and they're not intended oftentimes when you're in a succession planning and when you're in talent management meetings, but they can be code words for this is our expectation for these women, and then women feel sometimes feel that they have to show up in this other persona rather than being authentically themselves. Please, Lynette.
Can I add a little bit to that?
Yes.
You reminded me of something that I had here in my notes, which is even in the length. Obviously, behavior is so important, but also the words we choose are so important. At the organizational level, at the team, at leadership level, and within the individual level. Even and there's tons of information out there like this, but even think about how you phrase the words you use in an email or the language you use in a job description, right? So I'm going to give you some examples really quickly, right? A masculine job post, and I have to tell you, when I read this, it didn't bother me that much. And then once I kind of unpacked it, I was upset that I didn't notice it because I've become so ingrained and used to it that I don't even notice it, right? So in this job post, it'll say things like, we're a dominant marketing agency with leading clients from around the world. That's the masculine version. The gender neutral version is, we're a local marketing team with global clients. It strips some of that away. Strong decision-making and influencing skills versus proficient communication skills or oral, I'm sorry, that was not the right one. Strong decision-making skill and influencing skills versus strong analytical and creative skills. It's just those little nuances we don't even notice most of the time until we are educated around them. So there's this awareness piece I was talking about before. There's also sort of education piece around what you might be doing you don't realize you're doing, and how that might alienate others from even having it be attractive. And even just using keywords like for men, adventurous, aggressive, ambitious, challenge, champion versus compassion, considerate, honest, enthusiastic. Like, why are those separate? Right.
Wow.
And I'm going to add one more thing about this confidence piece.
Please.
I would challenge leaders to think about the content people present versus how they're necessarily presenting it, whether it's verbally or written, and kind of pay attention to what's being said versus how it's being said, whether it has confidence or not. And if we kind of let go of that, I think we might be surprised with how others, especially women, are going to speak up or articulate what they want or what they want to say or their point of view or what they are doing more. So anyway, some add-ons to that. Thank you, Crystal.
Oh my goodness, Lynette. I'm so glad you mentioned that aspect, and that's important because those are the words we use can send messages. They can make people apply or not apply, but we take in those words and we understand what those words mean. And I appreciate the fact that you said, just pay attention to the content rather than the context oftentimes. And I just remember a friend of mine, we were in Puerto Rico and neither of us spoke the language. But she's so confident that she told her daughter what was on the menu with such confidence. I said, how did you know what was on the menu? How did you know how to read that? She said, I didn't. But her daughter ordered, but she said it with so much confidence. But she said, I have no idea what's on the menu. But she said it with so much confidence that her daughter ordered the thing. And so it is paying attention to the content. And I appreciate that because that takes the weight off and it creates the freedom that you can show up authentically. So thank you so much. It's Johannes. I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we'll have some time in our breakout room.
So is that related to what we need to do in the marketplace?
Yes, yes. What's required to support the business case for change, and what are some of the triggers or symptoms that bias may be below the surface? And in your context, in the workplace, in the corporate, or in the leadership work that you do?
Yeah, so I think the change needs to be from a mindset shift. Sometimes, we try to force change. From my, from here, very hierarchical, male, older male, and after that would be just any male. And so when it comes to women, just even getting a position, being a place of influence is really, really far. So sometimes I think that creating the awareness society to understand them, to open the door, it's not for them just to the competition, or even it's not sympathizing okay, maybe I'm gonna, but okay, we want to advance, we want to be a better society, so we need to involve everybody else. And here's as I mentioned to you before, even my perspective about my mom, and as she's been so loving and raising 12, but that's how society look at it. and women don't have a job, as if it's not working, because she never clock out. From day in the morning to evening, she just constantly, still this day, my mom called me once in a day to check up on me. So she never quit being my mom, but our perspective have to be changed. I think this is a mindset shift, and the training need to be done and more. And again, it's not based on like, it's not even to set free, like, to set myself free, like, to be a better society together, because I cannot, we say we cannot clap in one hand, right? Take a two. There's a Nigerian proverb say, when the right arm washing the left also been the right also been washed. So how do we see collaborating, moving forward and advancing? So in a workplace, especially, like, people need to be a better, creating a better society in order to see advanced women coming forward, see not as a threat, but it's an opportunity, and grows together. That's all I want to say.
What we're hearing is a mindset. We're hearing a lot about awareness. And that seems to be the theme that is going through all of our conversation today, is raising awareness and having that mindset shift, and also raising awareness about our words, as just mentioned, about the way that we think, about the way that we respond, and awareness about our decisions and our judgments. And that is so important, because as we said at the very beginning, that we are all biased. It's what we do with those biases that make all the difference, that can either help or hinder. And so I thank you so much for such a rich dialogue, which I completely expected, and just all of the strategies and the thought-provoking ideas and context that you've given us, and sharing your stories have been so meaningful to us. And I certainly appreciate all that you have brought to the table. And I know that there are so many questions and comments, and we want to continue the dialogue. And I'm going to, at this point, ask us to, I'm going to close this particular part of it, and invite us to continue the conversation in our breakout rooms. And there are two questions simply, and that is, what are you willing to do differently as an individual to break this bias? We've had a lot to think about, a lot to digest, and in your groups, identify and at least agree on at least two ways that an organization can break bias. And those are two questions, and Anne has generously put them in the chat for us. Thank you, Anne. And I invite you to answer those two questions. It's certainly provocative questions in terms of, okay, we know this information now. This is the deep work. And what are we willing to do? So we'll take, will we put the time for us in the chat? It's 15 minutes then, Anne?
Okay, that's going to take us right up to the end. So I don't know if
Okay,
you want
well,
to
let's do about 7 minutes then. Let's cut that in half.
Okay, so I will put you into breakout rooms and have fun with your discussion.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Hopefully you had some great discussions. We look forward in the next few minutes to hear from each group. How many breakout groups did we have, Anne?
I think we had 4 that actually were functioning. We lost a few people in the transition.
Okay, yes.
People had to leave at the top of the hour, some people.
Yes, absolutely. So let's hear from Joel's group. Joel, thank you for your comments in the chat earlier.
Yeah, happy to. I'll invite Sue into the conversation too. Sue and I were talking about, how do we increase our individual ability to pay attention, as well as the collective ability within team, a group, an organization to pay attention. And so, we thought that paying attention allows us to, like maybe something triggers us in a moment, one-on-one or with a group. And you're like, well, boy, why am I noticing that? And how is that informing how I'm showing up and being and interacting with others? And so by being able to ask that question of yourself, what am I paying attention to? It can potentially allow you to reflect on any sort of stereotype, bias, or such that might be there. Now, you might need help doing it at times beyond your own self. So if you have the conditions of a psychologically safe community, a group, a team, then you might feel comfortable saying, I just noticed this in our conversation, and I'm wondering what sort of influence that has on our strategy, on performance management, as Lynette mentioned earlier. So I think there's something about increasing our ability to pay attention and inviting other people into the exploration of what you're paying attention to.
Wow. That's good, Joel. That's thought-provoking within itself. I made a note of myself for myself to pay attention, and I think our group spoke pretty much about the same thing in terms of paying attention, but paying attention to our words. And we spent a lot of time mostly talking about Lynette's point that she raised. Rachel, I don't know if you want to speak to that from our group. I don't think, Faith. Faith wasn't, yeah, I think she's there. I'm not sure. Faith or Rachel, yeah, either one of you.
Sure. Yeah. So we talked about, so I was saying that I was committing to, using that language around creating the space. And we're in a world where time is of the essence. Things move very quickly. Sometimes we just don't take the time to actually have these conversations. So being that person in the room that's going to, use that language and, kind of make sure that we're having those conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you, Faith. Rachel, do you want to add to that in terms of, and then we'll spend the next, and then they'll have the other group. Thank you.
Yeah, we were just interrogating how we as coaches can be so guilty of reinforcing language practice that is actually anxiety inducing for people and takes them away from their authenticity. And you don't even realize you're doing it. So I was saying I was so mind blown when Lynette said, we are a dominant player in the market. And my first thought was like, yeah, what if you are? Then I thought, wait a minute, yeah, that language does put a certain kind of pressure on your psyche. So I just absolutely loved what you shared, Lynette, and it became really the big conversation that we had. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. And another group. Yes, words are powerful, Charles. Absolutely. Okay, I think those are the groups that are represented today. I don't hear anyone else speaking, but certainly we are at the bottom of the hour, and I want to thank everyone, especially my panelists, for doing such an amazing job, for creating such provocative thoughts for us, giving us some powerful and practical strategies individually and corporately that we can all take away with. And I am confident, to use that word now, that we took a deep dive into how we can change the brain. And so thank you for helping us to make that shift today. And we are so appreciative of all that you've shared. And the story sharing was certainly powerful and memorable. And we are so very grateful for your generosity and your authenticity and your vulnerability and the work that you do in shaping change in your respective communities. So thank you so very much. And thank you so much for moderating and facilitating behind the scenes. And Sue, Charles, Joel, and Mustafa, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a true pleasure. Thank you so very much. Good night, everyone. Get
Thank
some
you.
rest,
Good
Johannes.
night. Thank you. Thank you, Anne.
Nice to
Thank
see everybody.
Thank you,
you.
Crystal. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.